Each year, the association gives an evangelism award to the church who has the most baptisms past year. And this year, and I think last year, and the year before that, maybe, it was Carbon. But y'all had 16 baptisms past year. So give your hand.
Here's my quick story about Dwayne Clower. First time I met him, he walked up to me, he shook my hand, he pulled me in real tight. He said, "Do you know the Lord?" I said, "Yeah, I do." He goes, "Good." He turned around and walked away, and that was our conversation. He goes, good, like that. And the second time he saw me, I talked his ear off for about 30 minutes, and he was trying his hardest to get away from me, but I wouldn't let go of him that time. And the third time I saw him, he looked at the scenes were too many to tell. I saw Abraham, there was Jacob and Isaac. I talked with Mark, I sat down with Timothy. But I said, "Timothy, I want to see my Jesus, 'cause he's the one who died for me." Bowed on my knees and cried, "Holy." I cried, "Holy, oh, so holy." Oh, I clapped my hands and sang, "Glory." I sing glory, oh, glory, glory. I clapped my hands and sang.
Very much still at work. I think you only need to turn on the news to see that, and especially just to see that people of faith are under attack right now. Between the shooting of a Christian school in Minneapolis to just over the weekend, the shooting of a burning down of a Mormon church. And then, of course, there are the events of September 10th, when Charlie Kirk was publicly murdered on a college campus in Utah just for sharing his faith and engaging in discussion with how his faith informed his worldview. That illustrates very much that the powers of darkness are at work. You see, we live in a culture in which many have been making a very hard push for a long time for our society to push out religion entirely and to become secular. There is a growing contingent of what I would call militant secularists out there today. These people, they're not just people who don't have a religion, but they think religion isn't a good thing. They view religion as being hateful, bigoted, and an obstacle to their version of progress. They therefore want to stamp out all traces of religion from the public, remove all acknowledgments of religion, and force the government to stomp out religious beliefs that are contrary to their own secular orthodoxy. The great irony here is that while these people claim they aren't religious in any way, the truth is that they enforce their beliefs, their orthodoxy, with the same zeal of a religious fanatic. And if you commit the great sin of heresy, there is judgment, but there is no grace. And I think that you saw a lot of this on September 10th and the days that followed after Charlie was murdered. Because it was one thing to see that happen, see that awful thing happen, but then you saw people online trying to justify it. Well, can he believe what he believed? He believed terrible things, or even celebrating it. In many ways, what I saw in the days after was equally traumatizing to the actual event itself, to see that there are people in our country who hold those types of views. And to my mind, it brought to me the words of Paul in Romans 1 about those who not only do evil, but justify it and celebrate it. And that is the type of forces that we are up against today. So if there's one thing that I want to press upon you tonight, it's that we're in a fight right now. And frankly, the fight is going to come to all of us in one way or another, by virtue of the fact that we just want to live out our faith in every aspect of our lives. And I have the privilege of being an attorney at First Liberty Institute and being on the front lines in this fight. Now, who are First Liberty? I'm sure many of you may have heard about us, but I figured I would tell you a little more about us. So we are the nation's largest law firm dedicated exclusively to defending religious liberty for all Americans. We represent people of faith across this country, pro bono, that's lawyer speak for free. And we do this whenever Americans' religious liberties are threatened. And the Lord has been extremely gracious to First Liberty. Year after year after year, we win 90% of our cases. If you talk to any law firm in the country, especially those in the nonprofit that are doing these kinds of civil liberty type cases, 90% is unheard of. So God has been so good to us. He's been so good, in fact, that we are currently 9-0 at the U.S. Supreme Court, and hopefully to be 10-0 come this May, because the court has just agreed to hear another one of our cases this term that just started today. So how does First Liberty do what we do? Well, the typical model of these types of firms that handle these types of cases is to hire as many attorneys as you possibly can, and then sue as many people as you possibly can, more or less. That's not quite how we do it at First Liberty. We do it a little bit different. Because you see, we view ourselves as part of a larger team. We view ourselves as building a coalition for religious liberty across this country. So when we take on a case, it's not just First Liberty attorneys that are fighting the battle. No, instead, we go out across this country and we partner with large law firms around the country to help us with our cases. And the types of firms that we get to work alongside us are the types of people that Fortune 500 companies pay top dollar for to help with their very serious and expensive legal matters. And what we go to these people and say is that, listen, if we give you everything you need to do this case and work alongside us, will you donate your time and help us fight these important battles? And what we found in doing this is that across the country, these attorneys, those especially who are Christians, say, I've been waiting my whole life for an opportunity like this. Because these people, they are representing these very big companies and what many in the secular world would say are very important cases, but often they've never had an opportunity to combine their faith with their talents. And so when we knock, they enthusiastically lock arms with us and walk step into the battlefield to fight these important cases. And I've seen this happen over and over again, where as soon as we get them on one case, we've got them. Because from then on, like, they want to do another one, and we're at the point where they're fighting over our cases quite often. And it's amazing to see that both at the more senior partner level, but also as the young associates, the young lawyers who work at these firms and may not even get to see a courtroom for many, many years into it just because of the stakes of the cases they're handling. They get to take on our cases and do something that is meaningful to them. And so that's amazing. And again, you have these people for life once they've done one of these cases, because that is God working in their heart and putting this passion in them. But why does religious liberty matter? It's no coincidence that the very first right listed in the Bill of Rights is the freedom of religion. You see, the founders understood that matters of conscience and religion form the bedrock upon which liberty and civil society can exist. Think about it like this. If people can agree to disagree on matters that they think have eternal consequences, and to live together despite those differences, it becomes a whole lot easier to work together on the sort of temporal political differences that we often see in Washington and around our country today. Also, if you look around the world, think of any totalitarian government out there. What is one thing that they cannot tolerate? Faith. They cannot tolerate people of faith and will actively persecute them. Now, why do they do that? They do it because they know that people of faith have an allegiance to something higher than the government. And that means that Christians, people of faith, they're an obstacle to the government achieving the kind of total control that it wants to establish whatever utopia that they may have in their mind that they want to achieve through their progress. And we see this over and over and over again. When that kind of government takes hold, the first flashpoint of conflict is in the churches. We can see this in our own country, and it's not that long ago that we saw this. I think we've just passed 5 years now since the COVID-19 lockdowns. In March 2020, our society went into lockdowns of all in-person gatherings, and that included churches. Across the nation, the government attempted to stop churches from meeting in person on the basis that churches did not offer what the government deemed to be essential services. I'm sure all of you remember that phrase very well. So, you could go to a grocery store, you could go to the liquor store, but not a church. Ironically, in Nevada, they even allowed the casinos to stay open, if you can believe it. So you could go to Caesar's Palace and play the slots, but not to the house of God to worship our Savior. And so during that time, as churches sought to navigate what was the new normal of that time and to figure out how to assemble and worship and how to do so safely, they were often met with resistance from the governments. They were met with bans or draconian limitations on the amount of people that could gather in a space. One example of this can be found in Louisville, Kentucky, whose mayor banned all religious services on the Thursday before Easter Sunday. Now, this ban applied regardless of whether people social distanced. It applied even to churches that wished to have drive-in church services, because apparently the COVID virus could jump from car to car with your windows up. Now, why that makes sense, I don't know, but that was the world we were living in back then. And so when this happened, a First Liberty client, On Fire Christian Church, had to make a choice. Were they going to follow the government? Were they going to follow God? They chose to fight. And so on Good Friday, First Liberty filed a lawsuit challenging this order. The very next day, the court granted an emergency motion by First Liberty for the church to have its Easter services. Praise God. This was the first major victory during this time. Others had tried, and it hadn't worked until First Liberty got into this fight. And we were pushing back on this kind of egregious infringement of Americans' rights to worship. And the fight continued across the country, and eventually there were multiple U.S. Supreme Court victories guaranteeing the freedom of all Americans to worship, despite any regulations that the government might put down based upon COVID regulations. It wasn't just for churches, though, that had this problem during the COVID-19 pandemic. Our military had some serious issues during this time for people of faith. During the pandemic, the Department of Defense issued a vaccine mandate requiring all members of the Navy to get the COVID-19 vaccine. This mandate made no exceptions for religious objections to the vaccine and required that anyone who would not take the vaccine be kicked out of the Navy. So the government decided that even if you gave your life to serve this country, had devoted years of great service to the country, if you refused to do this one thing, that was enough to throw all that away and kick you out. So after this mandate was issued, thousands of Navy service members requested a religious accommodation. Not a single one was granted. No matter what role these service members of the Navy played, there was no assessment of any of that. It was just, if you did not bow, if you did not bend the knee to the government's will, you were gone. And among those service members were 35 Navy SEALs. Now, I'm sure you know all about the Navy SEALs. These are the most elite fighting force in the world, the absolute best of the best, who have devoted their lives to this country. They faced losing everything that they had ever worked for over their faith. So when this happened, they contacted us, and First Liberty filed a lawsuit on behalf of these Navy SEALs. And we managed to convince a federal judge right here in Fort Worth to issue an injunction to prevent the Navy from punishing these brave men and women. But then something else happened. Beyond just helping those, we then turned this case into a class action. And so we got the judge to agree that his protection for those Navy SEALs was not just going to apply to the Navy SEALs, but to every single member of the U.S. Navy who had a religious objection. And so we managed to save all of those jobs. And it all started with those Navy SEALs taking a stand. And because they were willing to do so, that led Congress to permanently change the law to make sure that this kind of thing can never happen again, and that people of faith are honored when they wish to serve in the military. And so things are much better now in the military in this way. And I would say that's especially true now that the Trump administration is in charge. See, the fact of the matter is when people of faith stand up, God can accomplish some amazing things. It doesn't take skill to be courageous. It just takes faith and trust that if God's put it on your heart, that he's put it there for a reason. He's going to see you through the fire no matter what. I often think of Daniel, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, one facing the lion's den, the other the fiery furnace. They had the kind of faith that said, I know God can save me, but even if he chooses not to, I'm going to follow God anyways. Now, that's the kind of faith that I see in our clients all the time, and it is a huge inspiration to me. Let me tell you now about Coach Joe Kennedy. Coach Kennedy was a high school football coach from Bremerton, Washington, who made a simple commitment when he decided to become a coach. He was going to honor God, win or lose. And so what he would do is after every single game, he would go to the 50-yard line, take a knee, and say a quiet prayer. This prayer maybe lasted 20, 30 seconds. And if you were someone up in the stands watching the football game and you saw the coach doing this, you would probably not think anything of it. You might just think he's tying his shoe or something like that. But this prayer had an enormous impact of those who knew what he was doing and why he was doing it. And so players started to notice, and they asked, can we join you in doing that? And coach said, it's a free country. And so the practice grew. It grew and grew to the point where even players from the opposing team would go to the 50-yard line with coach to pray after. And this went on for 7 years without a single complaint. And in fact, the controversy about this all arose in 2015, so 10 years ago now. when someone from an opposing school called Bremerton to compliment the coach, and they thought it was just a great thing to see a coach doing this. And so naturally, after most schools do when they get complimented, they open an investigation. And when they opened this investigation, what they told Coach is that he was engaging in problematic behavior. And it was shortly after this investigation opened that First Liberty got involved in this case. And I will admit to you freely that when First Liberty got involved, we thought this case would settle in a matter of weeks. We thought that we would be able to bring the school to the table and get this whole thing resolved so Coach can keep praying, and that would be that. But that's not what happened. Seeking to cooperate with the school, Coach stopped praying with the students, but he simply wanted to go back to that personal commitment that he made when he started coaching. He wanted to pray for himself, by himself, at the 50-yard line. But that wasn't good enough. The school was so offended at the thought of people seeing Coach Kennedy pray that the only accommodations that they would offer him would be to pray where no one could see him, because you see, that religious stuff, it's a private matter, and it needs to stay private. And so they offered him places like the press box. You can go up to the press box after the game and pray there. Or how about better yet, how about you go into the janitor's closet and you can pray there after the game, Coach? That wasn't his calling. So he couldn't accept that. So again, Coach Kennedy was faced with a choice. He could give in or keep fighting, and he chose to fight. He's a Marine, so it's not a surprise that he chose to fight, but it was not an easy fight. And in fact, what ensued was a litigation spanning 7 years where Coach Kennedy lost again and again and again. We lost in the trial court. We lost in the Court of Appeals. We went up to the U.S. Supreme Court, and the first time they didn't take the case. But they did give us some hope, because several of the justices, when they denied hearing our case the first time, said, we've got our eye on this case, but we have a couple of questions about the facts of the case, so go clarify those and then come back later, which is what we did. But again, it was an ongoing fight. Went back down to the trial court, we lost again. Went back up to the Court of Appeals, lost again. And then, at long last, we got to the U.S. Supreme Court, and they agreed to hear Coach's case. And because of that, the Supreme Court issued a landmark ruling just a couple years ago now that not only won the case for Coach Kennedy, but overturned decades of bad precedent under a case called Lemon versus Kurtzman, which had been used to wage war on religion in the public square for decades. This was the case that the militant atheist groups would point to when they wanted to tear down monuments, take away religious holiday displays, take away prayer. They always pointed back to the Lemon case. And ironically, when we were deciding how to go forward with Coach's case before the Supreme Court, we decided that we weren't going to ask the court to go that far. We just wanted them to rule for Coach. But then, lo and behold, in the middle of arguments before the U.S. Supreme Court, one justice starts talking about the Lemon case and how bad of a case it is, and then another one chimes in, and they said, I think it's time that we get rid of this case, more or less is what you read between the lines on what they were saying, and that's exactly what they did. God was working through all of this, through the defeats to bring about his greater purpose that is now leading to a push to restore faith across the United States of America today. Let me tell you about another client of ours, Gerald Groff. Gerald Groff was a postal carrier in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Because of his Christian faith, he wanted a job that would allow him to honor the Sabbath, and he didn't want to work on Sundays. And that's why the post office seemed like a great idea. The post doesn't run on Sundays, so that was a great fit for him, at least initially. But things started to change over time. The post office began partnering with Amazon to deliver on Sundays, and so Gerald was asked to work on Sundays. He refused to compromise on his faith and sought an accommodation. He said, I will work any other day, any other holiday, just let me have my Sundays. He was fired just for wanting to go to church on Sundays and to honor the Sabbath. And so Mr. Groff filed a lawsuit against the post office challenging his firing as a violation of his civil rights. But you see, there was a huge obstacle in the way of Mr. Groff winning this case. I told you about the Lemon precedent a moment ago, a 7-year precedent that had stifled religion in the public across this country. Well, there's another case kind of like that in the employment sector called Trans World Airlines versus Hardison. And what this case dealt with was deciding whether employers truly had to accommodate people of faith in the workplace under a federal law known as Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, which regulates employment. And rather than honoring the plain text of the law, the Supreme Court, the same Supreme Court that decided the Lemon case I just told you about, said the text doesn't mean what it says. And if the employer can show that accommodating is even a de minimis burden, you don't have to accommodate religion. And so basically what happened is that anytime someone would request an accommodation and say no, they would lose, because the employer could always say, well, I can think of some reason that it might be a burden, and for many courts across the country, that was good enough. That all changed with the Groff case, because when we took it up there, the Supreme Court unanimously said that no, that is incorrect. Employers have to accommodate religion in the workplace. You have to honor people of faith and treat them fairly. So once again, we have one man making a decision to stand up for his faith, securing religious liberty rights for people across this country. When I talk about our clients, I'm often reminded about the significant courage that it takes to do these types of things when you're dealing with pressure from a government like this. And that brings me to my next case that I want to talk to you about, Dad's Place. Now, Dad's Place is a little church in northwest Ohio in a little town called Bryan, Ohio. Now, Bryan, Ohio is the home of Dum Dum Suckers. Maybe you've heard of them. Next time you have one, you can look at where it was made and it'll say Bryan, Ohio. And Etch-a-Sketches. And unfortunately now they are known for violating religious liberty because of what they did to Dad's Place pastor Chris Avell. See, Pastor Chris Avell didn't grow up as a person of faith. And in fact, he was an atheist. And he would say, I'm an in-your-faithist, because he liked to go to Christians and challenge them. He had that sort of pessimistic worldview that he wanted to disprove the faith. But God was working in Chris. Over the years, he slowly started coming to church. First, he and his wife came because it was basically a free date night for them. They met a preacher and invited him to their church, and they said, we have food and childcare. And they said, well, that sounds like a date to me, so sign me up and I'll go. But they went in, and over the years, there was this transformation that happened to Pastor Chris, where he went from being an atheist to being a pastor and feeling called especially to minister to those who may not be comfortable in your normal traditional church. Maybe those with a bit of a checkered past or who have fallen on hard times. So what Pastor Chris wanted to do is create a church that loves like family. He wanted a place where people could go to encounter Jesus day or night. And so he opened a church, and he wanted that church's doors to be open 24 hours a day and for someone to always be there for people whenever they might need to come. And so, as you can imagine, as a result of this, many, without anywhere else to go, found themselves in the church and began staying in the church overnight. This is especially true during the bitter Ohio winters, when the wind chills would get down into the negatives. And what was the city's response to this compassion, to allowing people without a family to have a family, for giving a place to go to those who had none? Well, they criminally charged Chris. First, they said it was all about the zoning laws. You didn't get the proper approvals from the city to open this church, and so we're going to file. First, they filed 18 criminal charges against a pastor just for helping the homeless, helping those who can't help themselves. But then they shifted. They said, well, really, we're going to dismiss the zoning. It's not really about the zoning stuff. What we're going to say is that you, Pastor Avell, are violating the fire code, because that sounds important. Health and safety, right? We're all about keeping people safe. And so what they said is that by allowing people to sleep in the church overnight, we are now going to say that you have to install sprinkler systems in an old building. You have to spend over $50,000, maybe $100,000. This tiny church whose congregation consists of people who have little to nothing. We know full well that their goal is to actually shut down this church for good. But they said this was a grave safety issue. Sprinklers keep people safe. Here's the great irony. Not a single motel in that town has a sprinkler system, nor do most of the apartment complexes. So these same people who they want Chris to throw out into the bitter cold could go to a motel and sleep with the same no sprinkler system that they had at the church, except there they are surrounded by sin and darkness, versus in the church they're surrounded by a loving family. And so the city filed both civil charges against him along with criminal charges. So he was in 2 courts at once for his faith. And the civil court ordered Chris to close his church, followed by a criminal court convicting Pastor Chris and sentencing him to 60 days in jail for his faith. Now, luckily, First Liberty has been in this fight for a couple years now, and we've managed to stay those court orders, and even as important as that, for around 2 years now, we have managed to keep the doors of Dad's Place open despite the city of Bryan's efforts to shut it down. Dad's Place is part of a growing trend that I'm seeing across this country of cities criminalizing compassion. We've represented multiple food ministries across this country, one in Arizona, another in Florida, where cities are trying to stop churches from feeding the hungry. And we're seeing cities forbidding churches from opening ministries designed to help those who need it most. Ministries designed to help men and women escape the horror that is the addiction of drugs and alcohol, helping them to break that cycle of addiction and replace it with something better, and that is faith in our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ. It's vital for churches to be able to do this. And I would say that there is no one who can do this job better than the church. We face a lot of complicated issues in our society today. I mean, homelessness, hunger, addiction, all these things. But the answer to all of them at the end of the day is the same. It's Jesus. And churches have to be free to be the hands and feet of Jesus to help those who need it most. Another important right that is at stake in our country right now is the right of parents to direct the religious upbringing of their children. I want to talk about the Encinas family in Southern California. In May 2024, Shay Encinas' 5th grade teacher read his class a book called My Shadow is